Welcome to Herbally Yours, an adventure into the world of natural medicine. Here is your host, Dr. Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse who will help you take the leap to ultimate wellness.
Greetings, and thank you for joining me, Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, for another edition of Herbally Yours, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Herbally Yours brings you the latest information about the many facets in the world of natural living. And today we are so happy to bring on board as our guest, Dr. Erica Elliott, who is a medical doctor, affectionately referred to as the health detective. And she draws from a wide range of disciplines, both mainstream and naturally oriented, in order to diagnose and treat chronic illness. She has successfully dealt with problems that do not respond to pharmaceutical drugs and other conventional therapies. These include such things as chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, severe allergies, chemical sensitivities, autoimmune disease, and much more. And Dr. Elliott is the author of a book, Medicine and Miracles in the High Desert, which chronicles her life among the Navajo people. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Elliott.
Thank you, Ellen.
Let's go back in time and visit Dr. Erica as a little girl. And what made you evolve to become a physician in the first place?
I come from a whole line of doctors on the Swiss side of the family. My Swiss grandfather was the town doctor, and then my mother's brother was a doctor. So I was exposed to medicine, but I never thought that I had what it took to be a doctor because I used my uncle in Switzerland as my role model. And he was a true genius, way ahead of his time. He was doing things that we're only now just beginning to use, like ultraviolet purification of the blood, apheresis, which is filtering out toxins from the blood. He was doing that over 50 years ago. And so I didn't think I had what it took to be a doctor. I was really mistaken, but I lived under that misconception that you had to be some kind of genius to be a doctor. But I sure learned that that's not the case. So I did many other things. I was always looking for my purpose in life, even as a young girl. I knew I was here for a reason, but I didn't know what that reason was. And I thought, surely there's more to life than just going through the motions of doing this and that, and then you die and it's over. I thought, I know there's more to life and I've got to find it. And so my search for purpose took me into some very interesting places. And in each place, I learned a piece of what I needed to find a meaningful vocation in my life. When I taught with the Navajo kids, I learned that I love to teach so much. And then I learned something else terribly important, which would aid me eventually as a doctor, is that if you really want your students or your patients to shine and become their true selves, you need to teach in a loving way and sort of care very much about your students. And I noticed with the Navajo students, when I first came there, they made no contact with me. They barely talked to me. They were profoundly shy. And I couldn't understand why they were in the fourth grade and couldn't speak English. Then I discovered it's because their teachers didn't care about them and they were learning stuff that was irrelevant to their lives, like Dick and Jane and stuff like that. And so when I started learning Navajo and showing that I cared about them, everything changed. They learned English so fast that it's almost unbelievable. By the end of the year, 3 students won a speech contest. And these were students that couldn't put together a sentence in English when I came on board. And so watching this evolution totally changed my life. And I realized that whatever I chose to do as my profession, as my vocation, had to include love And it had to include empowerment of the person I was dealing with or the patient and teaching. And so every place I went to, like the Andes in South America and working with indigenous people there, I learned that I had to have perseverance and courage. And finally, when I got to Boulder, Colorado, and decided to take a few advanced placement science courses, this is as an older student, everybody in the class was a pre-med student. And I'll tell you, they were not geniuses. There was no critical thinking. There's no asking why and stuff, but they were good at memorizing. And I thought, oh my God, I've lived under this misconception my whole life that you had to be some kind of genius to be a doctor. And so that was an epiphany, believe it or not. And so I realized this is my path. This puts all those pieces together. I love to see people feel better, get well. And so I dove in headlong. But gradually, over the years I was in mainstream medicine, I realized this was not my path. A little voice kept saying, this is not what you've been looking for your whole life, just giving out pills and treating patients like they're part of an assembly line. Medicine had become so corporatized that I realized this was not my path. Then a disaster happened to me, which actually was life-saving. And because it forced me off that path of mainstream, because I became so injured by chemicals that I couldn't work in that building anymore. And so in my attempt to get well, I went to all kinds of doctors. Nobody had a clue what was wrong with me. And then I came across a group of doctors called environmental physicians, and they showed me how to get well. And in the process, I learned some amazing things that I never learned in med school about the plants, the supplements, the diet. And pretty soon I was attracting people from all over the country who had problems that nobody knew what to do with. I had them even from Europe because it was all by word of mouth. They said, there's this doctor, she loves trying to figure out what's wrong and help you feel better. And she uses natural methods and only uses prescription drugs when there's no other alternative.
Well, that's a really good point, because I personally have worked in the field of natural medicine my whole entire life. I became a nurse in 1973, and for 20 years, I was the head nurse at a complementary center called the Corsello Center for Complementary Medicine, where we did exactly what you're talking about. We would use everything that worked, and now even it's all what science shows is evidence-based. And
Absolutely.
That is natural interventions, because they are actually the thing that work best with the least adverse effect profile, which is so important and seems to be ignored in mainstream.
Absolutely. It's really sad. So my first introduction with plant-based medicine actually was with the Navajo people. And once I started speaking Navajo, the children would invite me to go home on the weekend. They were in a boarding school, so they had to stay there all week, and often they didn't get to go home for months at a time. Once they warmed up to me, they would invite me to go to their family home in the middle of nowhere. And the family did not speak any English in these remote places, and they would invite me to their ceremonies where white people weren't allowed. They sort of accepted me almost like as though I was an honorary member of their tribe. And so I saw amazing things in these ceremonies, and they were it was all plant-based and chanting, making sand paintings and so forth. And then one of the families belonged to the Native American church. That's also known as the Peyote church. And it was illegal for white people in that era to attend. The Navajo family invited me to attend. And their plant-based medicine was peyote that the government gave them permission to harvest it in a place in Texas. And it was so profound what I experienced. In those sessions, I saw what would be called miraculous healing of babies, of adults. And then I had my own miraculous healing in one of those ceremonies. And I saw things that I could never explain to anybody. And so I just didn't talk about it for years because it was beyond most people's reality. And I was afraid they just would think I made it up. So it took me years to write this book because I reached a point where I didn't care if people believed or not. I just had to tell the truth and tell this story. And there are physicists who try to explain these seemingly miraculous healings, but all I can say is I don't really know, but I saw things that are mind-blowing.
Well, you do bring that whole essence of belief and spirituality into even the title of your book, because the title of your book does include that concept. And, so you're talking about a sacred planet book. So You're talking about the fact that there are sacred things beyond, let's say, the auspices of modern medicine that play into not just a belief system, but some very real outcomes. And then you actually have Joan Borysenko, PhD, writing the foreword. And her focus has always been on that energy type of more of a spiritual inference.
Yes, exactly. Would you like to hear about two things that are beyond explanation?
Yes, but let me reintroduce right here so everyone knows who they're listening to, because I want to remind you listeners that you are listening to Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Ellen Kamai, the natural nurse, and today my guest is Dr. Erica Elliott, medical doctor, family practice and environmental medicine. And we're talking about many interesting topics, including her new book, Medicine and Miracles in the High Desert. So, Dr. Erica, yes, we would love to hear a couple of the occurrences that you found, appeared to be supernatural, but it's actually in the realm of energy healing.
Okay, so the first one was my very first peyote ceremony, and a family that said that they were, quote, going to adopt me, and I was supposed to call them, my mother and my brother, sister, so they wanted me to view them as my family. And so when it was time to go to the ceremony, they told me no white man's clothes allowed. So I had to dress like a Navajo and put the velvet blouse on and the satin skirt and put my hair in what's known as a Navajo knot, and with all the jewelry and everything. I looked absolutely regal. I couldn't believe it. And so we went in there, and my Navajo mother sat next to me. And the peyote goes around in three forms: in a button, and in a tea, and in a powder. And I had just started learning Navajo. I could say very simple things like, how many sheep do you have? Is that your grandmother? Not much at all. I was just learning. So keep that in mind, so it'll make sense, the story I'm telling you. So she whispered to me, she said, when the sacred tobacco comes around, where you're supposed to inhale, exhale, and say a prayer. And she said, when it comes around, just pass it on. And so she inhaled and exhaled and prayed, and then she gave it to me and said, pass it on. And I did something really strange. I took it. I did not pass it on. And I inhaled the herbs, the mountain herbs that they collected. I exhaled, and then I prayed in Navajo. At the same time I was praying, my logical mind said, this isn't possible. You are having a mass hallucination. This plant medicine is making you think this is real. There's no way this is real. I kept thinking that as I was praying, and it was a long prayer. I don't even know what I said. And then I passed it on. Everybody was staring at me. So then the same thing happened with the sacred drum, the water drum. The people take it, and as they're beating, hey, then they sing these sacred songs. And my Navajo mother said again, after she sang, she said, pass it on. And I didn't pass it on. And I started drumming and I started singing a peyote song. Hey, nay, young, hey, hey, oh, hey. And again, I thought, wow, this hallucination is so real. It's more real than real life. And so then the evening passed and it started to become daylight and the ceremony was over and the plant medicine had already worn off. And so we filed out and we kneeled down, touched the earth with our forehead. We fanned ourselves with the eagle fan and we went into a cinder block house next door where the women had been up all night preparing a feast for breakfast. And we sat on the floor on a sheet and there was mutton stew, fried bread, canned peaches and stuff. And after we were seated for a while, the medicine man looked at me and started talking nonstop in Navajo while he was looking me right in the eyes. And I felt so uncomfortable. I was flustered because, I didn't speak Navajo, not like that. And then I said, excuse me, I don't understand what you're saying. I don't speak Navajo. And everybody burst out laughing. And he said, you sure talked up a storm last night. And I thought, oh my God, it really happened. How is that possible? So I thought it was so strange, so far beyond normal reality that I thought nobody's ever going to believe this story. And then the next story is about a miraculous healing. Do you want to hear that one too?
Oh, we would love to. So I would say that a couple of comments here. Those kinds of stories are not that unusual when people do venture into things that cause mind expansion. And they often have experiences that are interesting. And what you're sharing, I love so much. And I know it must have been a while ago, because unfortunately, in more current times, because I myself have lived in indigenous cultures sometimes for 5 years at a time in a grass shack in the middle of the jungle. And I write about it in my book, The Natural Medicine Chest. But I'm told now by younger members of the community that when you speak about these kinds of adventures, that there's something called appropriation, that you are sort of not allowed to be a part of sharing this information because you are appropriating sacred native knowledge. And that's something that I'm finding is a more current and newer aspect of discussing these kinds of ceremonial experiences.
Well, the Navajo people who've read my book just love it. In fact, they loved it so much that I donated 4,000 copies to the high schools on the reservation because they were so interested in hearing how their grandparents lived, because I'm talking about 50 years ago.
I know, about 50 years ago, because that's when I was doing this too. Because I'm 70 now. So when I was reaching 20 is when I did a lot of those things. I'm just saying from a personal viewpoint, I am actually finding it interesting and a conflict with people reaching out saying that that would be appropriation because you're not from that culture. And yet the people who are actually from the culture are very much in favor of having it represented. Honestly, you're not saying you came up with these concepts. You're saying that you were privy through God's will or for whatever reason to experiencing them, and you being a physician and having a voice that you're able to share it with the rest of the world. You're not saying someone from the tribe should not. It's just that this was your personal experience.
Yes, that's right. And they see, the Navajos that I've talked to, including medicine men, see what I've done in that light. They see that I'm just talking about my personal experience. And they also said they feel like I'm honoring them.
I think so too. So I agree with that. I've just come across this appropriation thing, which is a newer thing.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting because this is exactly the kind of work that, they're often pushing back on. But it's so interesting that you, being scientifically minded and very well learned in many subjects, had these physical experiences that could not be denied or explained away.
That's
So
right.
yes, please share another one with us.
Okay, so my teacher aide who helped teach me Navajo, her name Donna Scott. Some of the listeners might know her brother. He's very, very famous Navajo artist, R.C. Gorman. But anyway, Donna Scott was well-versed in her own culture and in white culture because her father was in the military. He was the famous code talker, Carl Gorman. The Navajos were famous code talkers, and it was the only code that was never broken in World War II because that language is almost impossible. I'm multilingual, but I never faced anything like this. This was so difficult. But anyway, so I would always ask her a lot of questions about Navajo culture and stuff, and she was extremely helpful to me. So one day, one of the students said, they didn't call me Miss Elliott like they're supposed to. They said Elliott. And this girl said, Elliott. And she asked me if I had a goiter because some Navajos do have goiters in those days because they didn't have iodine. And so, but I had a mass under my jaw. It's not exactly where goiters are, but it was under my jaw. And I had felt it for a long time and tried to avoid it. I did what some of my patients do. They like to pretend it's not there. But it was getting bigger, and it was hard as a rock. I knew nothing about medicine, but it was like a rock, and it was immobile. And so finally, I realized, I guess I better do something about it. And so I drove 2 hours to a charity hospital and on the reservation, and a white internist saw me and evaluated. He said, this does not look good. This looks cancerous. Let's get a biopsy. And so I, like many of my patients now, sort of got terrified, and I just left the hospital. Can you believe I'm a doctor now and I behave like that? But so I left the hospital really scared. And I told Donna Scott, my teacher aide, about it. And she said, oh, we'll get your medicine man to take care of that. And so she gave me the name of a medicine man and how to get him. It was so hard finding him. Listen to these kind of instructions. So you cross the arroyo, and then there's a juniper tree on the right, and then you go a few more yards, and then you'll cross another arroyo, and there's a big chamisa bush on the left. You go there, and then, I don't know how I ever found this guy. And so he looked at it and thought about it for quite a while. And he said, this isn't my specialty. And so he gave me the name of a Hopi. Usually Navajos and Hopis usually didn't get along that well in that era, but he referred me to a Hopi. I finally found him out herding sheep, and he said the same thing. This isn't my specialties. So I said, Donna, it's not working out. Oh, I'm so discouraged. And so then my Navajo family that adopted me, they said, oh, this is no problem. We'll put on a ceremony for you, a peyote ceremony, and we'll take care of that. But it's so expensive for them. They live in such poverty to have a ceremony. You have to butcher one of your sheep, and you have to pay the roadman. That's the name of the medicine man who runs the peyote ceremonies, roadman. And so they shared it with a family with a baby, so it cut the costs. And so we prayed and sang all night, and I sort of forgot that this ceremony was for me, and I was focusing on the baby and noticing that the baby was getting calmer and calmer, and that bright red copper color was getting more normal, and the baby started gurgling, so I could see, my God, the baby was getting better. And again, I completely forgot about me. And so we chanted and sang all night and everything. And at the end, we filed out just like before, and went into the cinder block house and sat down for breakfast. And everybody was staring at me. And I didn't know why they were looking at me. And I was kind of looking, seeing if my blouse was closed or something, seeing if something was off. And all of a sudden, my hand flew to under my jaw, and there was nothing there. And to this day, 50 years later, sometimes you'll see me in a sort of distracted way, putting my hand there. I was in such disbelief. How is that possible? And I didn't know how to explain it. It was just so completely mind-blowing to me.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all those interesting stories with us. Somebody I know in Santa Fe, New Mexico is Linda Lancaster.
Yes, she's famous.
Yeah, she's been friends. She and I worked together in a holistic clinic in the early 80s, and we've remained really great friends for years. And it's wonderful that you have a clinic now where people can get in touch with you if they're interested in learning more, or I imagine you can do therapeutic interventions at a distance nowadays with people, not only through prayer, but also recommending steps that people can take to help themselves heal. So what's the best way for people to find you?
Oh, well, except I'm not, for the last 5 years, I haven't accepted new patients because I have 1,200 patients. And for one person, that's just way too much. However, here's for your listeners. I blog as a public service for all the people who can't see me. And the blog is a mixture of medical posts where I give information that their mainstream doctor's not going to give them because they just don't know or they don't have time or something. And mixed in with those are excerpts from the memoir I'm working on now called From Mountains to Medicine, My Search for Purpose, and healthy recipes and so forth. So if you click on medicine, then just the medical posts will appear. And I think you're going to find some really useful information like flu prevention and treatment, which includes all sorts of things, including COVID. It includes alternatives to treating osteoporosis,
natural therapeutics. Yeah. So we actually have to bring this to an end, but I guess people can find that through Erica Elliott, MD.com, and then find the blog.
It's actually, the blog is this. It's Musings, Memoir, and Medicine. Musings with an S. musingsmemoirandmedicine.com.
Okay, and we do have that as a click-through. For those of you who listen to the show and then visit the archives, we'll have that as an easy way to find it. So thank you so much for being our guest today, Dr. Erica Elliott, MD, author of Medicine and Miracles in the High Desert. Thank you so much. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in once more to Herbally Yours, produced in the studios of 90.3 WHPC, Nassau Community College, Garden City, New York. For further information, email us at whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamai, the Natural Nurse at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.